The Book of Rebekah by Maxwell. Chapter 4. The Burnt Cave. At first, Rebekah had thought it was her imagination, her guilty conscience at running away, that conjured the haunting sound of her name on the wind. "Rebekah! Wait!" She heard it again, and this time she knew it was real. She turned around, scanning the rocky terrain below her, and saw nothing. "Rebekah!" There it was again, and it sounded a lot like Devorah? Rebekah called out, letting her deep voice roll across the steep hills. "I'm here!" Devorah shouted back. "Help!" Rebekah set off at a run, retracing her steps and searching the area until she found her nurse, Devorah, stumbling along the steep mountain path. She was limping, and her face was red and stained with tears. "What are you doing here?" Rebekah asked, shocked by the sudden and unlikely appearance of her childhood nurse. "Why didn't you stop?" Devorah cried. "I've been calling out to you the whole way." "I'm sorry," Rebekah said. "I wasn't listening." "I could have told you that," Devorah said, a little crossly. "Would you like to tell me what's going on?" "I could ask you the same thing," Rebekah replied. "What are you doing out here? You shouldn't be out of the house." Devorah sighed and wiped the tears from her eyes. "I heard footsteps on the roof. I thought we were being robbed. What do you think I saw when I looked out the window?" Rebekah blushed but kept her mouth shut. "I saw you jumping off the roof and running away crying." "Rebekah, I haven't seen you cry since you were a little girl. What happened? Is it your father? I can't think what else would make you cry like that." Rebekah felt the tears returning and hid her face in her hands. "It's a terrible mess, Devorah. A terrible, terrible mess." "What is? Surely it can't be so bad as all that," Devorah said, wrapping her arms around Rebekah and holding her tight. "They are going to marry me or murder me. I heard them say it with my own ears," Rebekah cried into Devorah's neck. "Marriage? Murder? This makes no sense. Why would they say such things?" Devorah asked, pulling Rebekah down beside her to sit on a low rock. It was an uncomfortable spot with a sweeping view of the city in the distance. "Father is dying," Rebekah said, pressing her fingertips to her eyes and willing them to stop their crying. "And they say that I am. It's no secret that Bethuel is a sick man, but that's no reason to." Rebekah looked into Devorah's eyes. "He wants to name me as his heir. They say I am a tum-tum, but I don't know what that means, except that now people want to kill me or ruin my life. Do you know what it means?" Devorah broke eye contact. "I think it means that you could be a boy if you wanted to, or at least claim the same rights." Rebekah's eyes widened in shock and disbelief. "But I don't want to be a boy," she said, horrified. "Think about it, Rebekah. You could be rich. You could be anything," Devorah urged her. "Except being myself," Rebekah said, shaking her head and looking resentfully at the distant city. "I don't want to be a boy. And besides, Emma and Laban will kill me, or worse, before that ever happens." "What could be worse?" Devorah asked, shocked. "Marriage, confinement, the veil," Rebekah replied. "Is that why you ran? You think you can hide out with your goats until this all goes away?" Rebekah hung her head. "My friends. I thought maybe my friends could." "Friends? What friends?" "The herders. They'd help me, I'm sure." "Those filthy peasants? What could they possibly do to help you, a princess of Haran? From what you've told me, they can barely feed themselves. They live in squalid little caves, and they know the mountain better than anyone. And they would help me," Rebekah insisted. "Help you what?" Devorah asked. "Escape," Rebekah replied emphatically. "They could help me escape." They didn't say anything for a while then, and the idea of escape hung tantalizingly in the air between them. A bird flew overhead, and Rebekah watched it, wishing she could catch hold of its tail and fly far away. "And all the while," Rebekah said sadly, "my father is dying, and I can't feel anything except fear. No sadness, no grief, just fear." "You're right to be frightened," Devorah confessed. "When Bethuel dies, my future will be as uncertain as yours, and I have my daughter to think about. Rebekah felt doubly guilty then. I'm sorry. Here I am worrying about myself, when you and Divsha— At least my mother and brother aren't plotting to kill me, Devorah said, with a reluctant smile. Don't be sorry. We can figure this out together. That's why I'm here. But what is the answer? I would rather die than be locked away from everything that I love. I can't lose everything that makes me who I am and still be myself. Rebekah opened her arms in a wide circle that encompassed the mountains, the valleys, and the vast expanse of open sky. I will never give this up for a husband and a house. Devorah took Rebekah's hand in her own, saying, I can understand why the idea of marriage is so abhorrent to you, Rebekah, but if you found the right man, don't you think you could be happy with a house of your own? Rebekah shook her head. I don't want to live behind four walls and only allowed out with a man to escort me. I'm perfectly capable of escorting myself, and I'm not going to wear a veil. I can't breathe when it's on me, she said, pounding her fists against her long thighs. You know, in Egypt, marriage between men and women is more equal. Women can work outside the home and make their own money. They can learn numbers and counting, and some of them even learn reading and writing, and they can go to the market and visit their friends simply by walking down the street, and their husbands don't mind at all. It's a different life than this, Devorah said, looking wistfully into the distance for a moment, before smiling and saying, The problem is, there aren't many attractive Egyptian princes wandering around these parts looking for wives. If there were, I'd have one for myself. You've never spoken to me of Egypt before, Rebekah said. Some things are too sweet to be remembered without pain. I had to leave all that behind when I came here, and I did my best to forget, Devorah replied, looking sad and tired. But if you could have a marriage between equals, Rebekah, wouldn't you take it? If you could be free to live your life as a partner to a man and not his property, would you take the chance to get away from here once and for all as a wife? Rebekah answered almost immediately. She didn't need to think about it. I do not wish to be married. Not ever. And knowing what I now know about myself, which is barely anything at all, I believe that God has not made me to be any man's wife, she said fiercely. But upon seeing Devorah's stricken face, she grew bold and said, But if it meant you, me, and Divsha could get away from here, then I would do it. I am tired of this life, and I want to run away, but not without you and Divsha. I realize now that I couldn't go without you. If that means getting married, then— Devorah squeezed her hand and took a deep, steadying breath. Thank you, Rebekah, she said, as her chin trembled under the force of her emotions. I hope it will never come to that, but I fear if I do not get Divsha away from here, she will soon fall victim to the same fate you hope to escape. Rebekah stood up and held out her hand to Devorah. Come on, let us visit with the filthy peasants in their squalid little cave, she said with a wicked smile, and see if maybe they will save our lives. Is it far? Devorah said, standing up on trembling legs. It's just over the next rise, Rebekah replied, giving Devorah her arm and helping her to limp along the stony goat track. Upon reaching the tranquil valley, Rebekah was expecting to find the quiet pastoral scene she'd left behind only a few hours before, with Aviel tending to the flocks and Batel feeding her baby, or perhaps preparing the bread that the men would eat for their dinner. Instead, the cave where she'd spent many a warm and happy night was smouldering, a black smear of soot scarring the cliff face where a fire had burned its way out through the opening. Batel! Rebekah gasped, stepping forward. Wait! Devorah pulled her back and pointed down into the valley. There were 4 men, dressed in the clothes of field workers, not sheep herders. They were driving the last of the sheep towards town, striking them with sticks and kicking at them to hurry the frightened animals along. They don't look like shepherds. No, but they are my father's men, Rebekah said, as the rage began working its way up the back of her neck. She shook off Devorah's restraining hand and strode forward. "You there! Stop that at once!" she yelled. The men looked up guiltily and then started walking faster. "I said stop!" The largest of the men stepped into Rebekah's path as the other men rushed away with the sheep. "My lady," he said, looking at the ground and avoiding making eye contact with her. "What happened here?" Rebekah demanded. "And where are the sheep herders?" "Who am I to say?" The man smiled and scratched innocently at the ground with his bare toes. The man's strangely gleeful attitude led her to suspect he might have been one of the men who'd thrown stones at the sheep herders the last time they'd been into town. It was a cowardly attack on unsuspecting and unarmed men. "Where is the woman who was living in that cave?" Rebekah said, stretching out her long, muscular arm and pointing at the smoke-blackened cave. The man smiled again and shrugged insolently. "The princess asked you a question." Devora was panting hard from her descent into the valley, but no less enraged by the man's outrageous rudeness. "Answer her at once." "I don't take orders from you, woman," the man sneered. Devora swelled with indignation. "How dare you speak like this in front of my lady?" she shouted, stepping forward and pointing her finger accusingly. "Two women out alone and running after sheep herders. Your fathers would be ashamed." The man yelled, made a sucking, gravelly noise in the back of his throat, and then spat directly into Devora's face. The spittle was brown and foul-smelling, striking her on the cheek and chin before dripping onto her chest. Devora stood there, frozen in shock, as the pressure and grief of the day rose up inside Rebekah's breast. She was so tired of her own powerlessness, of being totally unable to do anything to protect herself, that she snapped. Without thinking, she drew back her arm, clenched her fist, and struck the man hard on the side of his face. All her strength, power, and rage went into the punch, and it drove the man down into the ground. "You pig!" she screamed, kicking dust into his face as he cowered in fear. "They were my friends. I need to find them." The man scrambled away, found his feet, and began to run. Rebekah considered chasing him down. She could catch him easily, but Devora was there, dragging her back. "Let him go! Let him go!" she begged. "Please, he isn't worth it." Rebekah watched the man go, burning his features into her memory so she might find him and discover the truth about her friends. When he was a safe distance away, the man raised his fist and shouted, "You'll pay for this, princess, but Thor won't be able to protect you forever." Devora had to use all her strength to prevent Rebekah from running the man down, but eventually he made it over the ridge safely. "I should have killed him," Rebekah raged. "Yes, and then what?" Devora asked. "How would that help us?" "It would help me feel better," Rebekah shouted, stamping her large feet all over the rumpled sand where the man had fallen. Devora grabbed her by the arm and shook her. "Rebekah, why are we here?" Rebekah tried to break free from Devora's grasp, but her gentle, loving nurse gripped her tightly, insisting on an answer. "To escape," Rebekah answered finally. "Yes, and the only people in the whole world who might help us are gone," Devora said, letting go of Rebekah to search in her pockets for a cloth to wipe the spit from her face and dress. "We must find out where they've gone." "Come on," Rebekah said, turning to the gaping black mouth of the cave with a deepening sense of trepidation. Inside, they found no sheep herders, dead or alive, and nothing that would tell them where the sheep herders had gone. Patel's meager possessions were gone. The precious metal pot and the colourful blanket Rebekah had given her as gifts were not there, and Rebekah was relieved. Wherever Patel was, she would be warm, and she would have a pot to cook in. "But why did they burn it?" Devora asked, coughing and covering her mouth with her headscarf against the acrid smell. "I don't know. Why do men do anything?" Rebekah replied, pushing her hands into the still warm ashes of the campfire she had created with her own breath that morning. Her long fingers probed the blackened ground as if she might find Patel there. Devora began to cry. fleeing the cave and the awful blackened walls. Reluctantly, Rebekah followed her. "Maybe I can find them," she said weakly, staring out at the expanse of wilderness that surrounded them. Devora turned in an aimless circle, crying, "What are we going to do now? It will be dark soon. Divsha will be worried. And the Sabbath. We must not forget the Sabbath." Exhausted and beaten down by everything she'd seen and heard, Rebekah held her hand out to Devora and said, "Let's go home. Tomorrow we'll start work on a new plan. We'll figure out how me and you and Divsha can escape to Egypt." Devora gasped. "Really? You mean it?" Rebekah nodded. "Or we escape to their mountains and become bandits," she said, drawing her finger across her throat and baring her teeth. "Well, I know which one I'd prefer," Devora laughed. They walked slowly. Neither of them was anxious to get back inside the confines of the house, and Devora's blisters were red, raw, and painful. Any thoughts of escaping to the mountains and living off of goat's milk and wild mushrooms were crushed by the sight of Devora's pathetic but determined limping. Rebekah thought that was half the problem. Their lives had not equipped them for freedom. They were tame beasts. Even she, better able than most women, could not protect herself if a man decided to make her his victim. They were defenseless. Divsha hadn't stepped beyond the walls of the palace since the day 24 years earlier when Devora had carried her inside them as a baby. They must use what little they had to try and save themselves. Despite their reluctant pace, they soon reached the city limits. "We'll stop at the well," Rebekah said, "and I'll get you some water for your feet." Rebekah seated her friend on the little stone bench and began drawing water. That was when she saw them, 2 field workers, thin and grubby, staring at her like hungry dogs. "There they are!" shouted one, a small man with big gaps in between each of his brown teeth and a wide mouth stained at the corners. "Khan, over here!" shouted the other, gesturing to unseen men whose approaching feet Rebekah could hear echoing on the hard-packed earth. Khan looked even more slovenly than the first man, with a greasy blue cloth wrapped around his filthy head. Rebekah dropped the water jug and backed towards Devora, her eyes wide with fear. Soon, thin and ragged men arrived at the well from all directions, shouting and cheering. "We found them! We found them! Laban will surely reward us for this!" Without hesitation, the men grabbed them and began dragging them in the direction of home. Rebekah and Devora screamed their protests, but none of the men listened. There was an angry jeering and a menacing undercurrent that made the men bold. Rebekah tried to break away from them, but they shoved her roughly. She tripped and stumbled. The men laughed and leered at her with lust in their eyes. Finding her feet, Rebekah took a deep breath and tried to steady her nerves for whatever was about to happen, but it was useless. Panic rose in her throat, and she would have screamed had the men not taken that opportunity to press in on them very tightly. All the air left her lungs, and the gap-toothed man with the wide, stained mouth began tugging at her tunic. The traitorous fabric tore, and the sleeve came away in his hand, revealing her bare shoulder. The man licked his lips. She could see Devora struggling with his friend, the one with the greasy blue turban. He had her by the wrists and was attempting to push her against the wall, but Devora fought like a wild animal, scratching and thrashing. It reminded Rebekah that she had strength left inside her. She was not a meek little lady from the village. She was a hunter in her own right. She had muscles, and she knew how to use them. She was at least a head taller than any of the men present, and heavier too, and this she used to her advantage. She kicked one man savagely in the knee, felt a sickening crunch, and watched with satisfaction as he crumpled to the floor. She punched a second man in the nose, and a third man she sent flying backwards into his companions with an almighty shout and a scream of rage, but she would fight off one man only for him to be replaced by another. Soon they had her pinned up against the wall next to Devora, who screamed for someone, anyone, to help them. 2 more men pushed themselves forward, each of them taking hold of Rebekah's legs, pulling at her dress, spreading her thighs, and leaving small round bruises wherever their probing fingertips dug into her flesh. "No, Rebekah screamed with everything she had. She had only just discovered that there was something different about her sex, and now, before she had even had a chance to explore it herself, these men wanted to uncover her, to expose her secret inner self and steal it. She screamed again as pure terror overtook her. No, no! The gap-toothed man pressed himself against her. She was looking directly into his eyes, and the murder she saw there killed any hope that she would survive this assault. "Take your hands off that woman!" A big man with a booming voice, backed up by the violent swinging of a large wooden club, beat a path through the skinny bodies of Laban's jostling field workers. They tried to fight him, grabbing hold of his arms to stop the lethal swinging of Rebekah saw was not a club, but a giant rolling pin. It was the baker, and here came the baker's sons, throwing punches and cracking heads. They were all big boys, well-fed, confident in themselves and each other. The fight didn't last long after that, and the field hands melted into the twisting, narrow streets of the city, more than a few of them dragging an unconscious father or brother with them. "Thank you," said Rebekah to the large man who stood before her grinning, blood dripping from the rolling pin in his huge hands. "I think you may have just saved our lives." "And more importantly, our virtue," said Devorah, warily tugging her veil back over her head and putting her big ugly cloak around Rebekah's bare shoulder. "I would like to repay you for your kindness, sir, but right now I must go," and Rebekah attempted to pass the baker, but he barred her way with his massive book. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to take you home, princess. Your brother has every man in the village searching for you both. It's not safe for you to be out." He took Rebekah by the top of her arm, not roughly, but firmly, and started walking her along by his side. Her legs were too weak to resist the movement, and it was all she could do to follow along and try not to fall apart completely. She looked behind her, and Devorah was getting a similar treatment from the next largest of the baker's sons. Her face was as white as the new moon, but her eyes were burning. Rebekah took strength from the sight of Devorah, who looked anything but beaten. Thank you for listening to the Book of Rebekah by Maxwell, Chapter 4, The Burnt Cave.